This was a session, and if you wouldn't mind just raising your hand. So the participants were Greg from BWRC, and Hang from Catholic University, and Kira out there in the back from National Instruments, and myself, I'm Manu Gosain from Northeastern University, and the hat I wear here is as a member of the Power Project Office. So essentially the motivation here was to answer some questions. Again, thanks for the introduction. So we didn't really do presentations. We actually really wanted this to be hands-on and address some fundamental questions, since at least in my, this is my first RCN, but having looked at previous agendas from the previous workshops, this is the first time I think a community testbed session was addressed. So we sort of wanted to level set first with the members, with the panelists, as well as the attendees, what exactly the state of millimeter wave research testbeds is, at least in the US academic community. And essentially the first testbed of its sort that has been funded by the National Science Foundation under the umbrella of the PAWR Platforms for Advanced Wireless Research program is the Cosmos platform. And yours truly, NYU Wireless, is a member of the team. So is Columbia University, so is Rutgers University, and so is the City of New York. And the goal is to basically deploy a citywide large-scale wireless testbed, an end-to-end system. So as you can see, millimeter wave is just the RF enabling technology. And not only that, it basically, given the cost trade-off, will effectively be only available on about 25% of the deployed sites around the Columbia University campus. So we are actually looking at field deployable millimeter wave systems at 28 and 60 gigahertz. And essentially, one of the first comments that came from the group is that's what 5G is doing today. We really want to push the envelope and look at spectrum horizons above 100 gigahertz. So what can you do for us? And the answer was nothing much at this point, at least in the power context. So that was a good input to take in for the testbed community to develop something that does not exist today, or maybe exists in small pockets and only for a very few subset of people. So that was sort of the power story. That's essentially the only NSF-related academic large-scale community, the emphasis being on community, meaning it's going to be available to all the researchers here in the room, as well as the broader research community. After that, Greg briefly talked about Hydra, which is being built, or has been built, at the Berkeley Wireless Research Center. And essentially, I don't want to butcher the details, but it's a massive MIMO 75 gigahertz, 128 element millimeter wave system. Currently works only in the uplink side, so they have about 60 clients and the base station, and they have a working implementation on the uplink side, with emphasis being working on getting the downlink going, because that's how you discuss or research on higher layers, network and MAC, etc. So then we sort of tried to answer or tried to discuss some of the fundamental questions of how does a testbed benefit this community, and that's when we started to narrow in and focus mostly on meeting the needs of this community, really digging deep into the physical layer specifications, layer 2, layer 3, and not as much worrying about applications and transport at this point, because we need the base infrastructure here, and we need some consensus in the community on what's important and what needs to be done. Again, for the US academics in the room, there are some instruments available in the National Science Foundation funding cycles, specifically CRI and MRI, which are used to award infrastructure grants. So the goal here was where do we stand in addressing the fundamental research challenges in millimeter waves, and at what scale should we be imagining or envisioning specifically building millimeter wave systems and testbeds? Are we at a point where a community scale or a community size, large scale, shared testbed resource. Are we at that point, or are we still at the point where we need instruments which you basically can get funded through small MRI grants and basically represent or develop channel models? Obviously, we heard from the keynote that more measurements are always welcome, but have we sort of gathered enough data and come to some consensus that we want to take the next step and actually develop something as a community that's going to be useful to everybody? Question 3 was something we did not get to, but again, just to put it out here in front of the audience, the goal here was to actually understand who the actors or what the terminology used for this testbed would be. So to reflect this back at the group, essentially looking for volunteers in this community who would want to be either a experimenter, meaning a user of the testbed, a testbed provider, so a person or an institution that's going to host this testbed or the system, or actually develop it. And then the third, and quote-unquote the most boring part, which is actually keeping the millimeter wave testbed system up and running. So these are sort of the candidate roles, and again, we're looking for members in this community who sort of raised their hand, and we did get some volunteers for a couple of those options there. Fourth was sort of to level set, I think something that was said on yesterday during the industry panel, which is essentially from companies and industry to stay away from the modem and the silica. So as the closer you are to the device end, the barriers to entry are very high. And essentially, that's something that us as a community trying to get access to millimeter wave systems will have a very hard time. So we need some partnerships. And there were some creative solutions that came up, and I'll get into those. And I think that's sort of one of our most concrete steps that came out of our discussion. The cost-performance trade-off models. So essentially, I think this again is to justify the cost and the investment needed to build these community size or individual campus size testbeds. As you can imagine, currently the state-of-the-art or commercially available solutions sort of are quite pricey, and again, you need to be part of either a very prominent research group or a research center to even get access to some of these instruments. And the goal here is to sort of somehow democratize that access by developing these millimeter wave testbeds. The other one, so the next point was essentially an action item of sorts, was to conduct sort of a gap analysis, paint a picture of what's actually currently available in terms of systems, both commercial, open source, some academic efforts such as Hydra and the Power Cosmos platform, and basically try to understand where the gaps are and where actually this community can develop, and where we actually will need to partner with some industry members, and how do we entice them, or how do we put a value proposition to actually attract industry to contribute to the testbed. A couple other things just brought up more for information's sake was looking at other open source communities, specifically in the telecom space, the Telecom Infra project. There is a Telegraph 60 gigahertz point-to-point radio developed by Facebook, which they now have opened up in what they're calling a sounder-in-a-box program, where as an academic, you can actually go and apply to obtain one of these radios and actually use them for channel sounding in 60 gigahertz if needed. So that was more informational here. I did share a slide deck with Akbar, and please feel free to post that to the website. Then we got into, what sort of experiments could a testbed support? I think this sort of was relayed back from the comment, again, made in the industry session, where in the standards bodies, there was people who work on radio and people who work on network aren't really talking to each other. So that was another motivator to build an end-to-end system, a millimeter wave system, where actually these different silos are forced to talk to each other and come up with standardized or common APIs or common interfaces between layer 1, layer 2, layer 2, layer 3, which currently, at least in our understanding, do not exist today. So that would be another work item that can be taken up here. Last but not the least, a big thing was if these systems are being built, they need to be highly calibrated, they need to be really well managed, and the data needs to be very clean, well managed, well documented, lots of metadata, so that any of the data, either IQ samples, channel state information, whatever is captured, is useful to the users of this eventual testbed. I'll pause here if any of the panelists want to jump in, if I forgot to cover any item. If not, I'll move on to sort of what the, do you want to add anything, Hang? Or, no, okay. So basically what came out. So some of the action items that came out, I think the biggest one that came out, and I think garnered a lot of excitement, at least after the session, where some other volunteers from other breakout rooms came in and sort of jumped in, were to actually build a reference design in this community by building together or piecing together all the different research done at the system level, some at University of Wisconsin-Madison, some at Berkeley, and some at Washington State University. The idea being to have a very modular approach to pick out all the discrete components and actually do a layout, an RF board layout, and essentially spit out something that can be developed or something that can be shared with the broader community, where the community can raise their hands and say, yeah, if you build this, I'm going to use it. And essentially what this gives us is the collective bargaining power to go out to a manufacturer or an RF assembly shop like QuickPack, et cetera, to actually build these things, and also gives confidence to the federal agencies such as NSF to see that there's community interest in a project or in a system that's actually been built from the ground up, completely open source, at a price point or at a cost that can be afforded and can be distributed at a wide enough scale. And that was sort of, I think, the big one. Again, I'll pause here, wait, if Greg or any of you want to add anything or fill in the gaps here. Any questions from the audience about that approach going forward? Because one of our goals, at least on the session, was to think about the next couple of RCNs, that there is a year and a half left. So the goal would be to output something, before the next RCN, at least gather things maybe similar to what Marco has done in a shared Google site, and start contributing some of these discrete components if you have them available, or point the broader group to who you've been working with on your supplier side if you've been building these systems, and sort of come to a consensus so we can present back to the community the next time we meet as a group, with a broader goal being in a year and a half coming up with a concrete proposal that can be built or written into a grant proposal that can go and be received by the NSF under the purview of any of the programs that were mentioned earlier. In addition to that, the idea here is also about the other large-scale efforts that have been developed. So I mentioned the PAWR program. The timeline for that project is to deploy their millimeter wave system. So I apologize, I think I skimmed over the details, but essentially the phased array system that the Cosmos platform's using, and again, Sandeep and Harish are part of that team, is an IBM Ericsson 64 antenna element, 28 gigahertz phased array, which has 4 ICs. So it might not be it might not be useful for some of the really tackling the fundamental research questions about, so there were points asked about, will you get per antenna channel state information? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know, Sandeep, if you have that information. Yeah, if you oh, there's a mic there. If you want to add, so that was a question asked about per antenna CSI from the IBM phased array.
Right now, it's a phased array, so you can only get that to the extent that you can sweep over with multiple phases. I don't know if that was your question. So it's an analog phased array. So there's 8 anyway. I can give more of the details, but it's not digital on each one.
I think you're raising many interesting and good questions, but I'm still seeking some answers in terms of, for this community, to take advantage of power, and specifically Cosmos power. I know this is just has started. Those of us who are not directly as part of the 2 teams, how are we, what's the mechanism for getting involved? And maybe relatedly, and this is more like to NSF and the power, I know there's an upcoming phase supposedly intended for the research efforts to make use of the testbed. What's the timeline on that part?
So that one I'm going to beautifully just deflect. And that's my, karate move right there, goes to NSF. I unfortunately don't have the either authority or anything, to talk about access per se. What we have done is talk about federation with European testbeds and platforms similar to the 5G efforts that are coming up. So 5G in Fire, 5G Tonic, all the testbeds that are coming up. We've started discussions. I think there is an open call in the EU ICT 21 that's going to fund CSA, a coordinating entity that will essentially interface or liaison with the PAWR program. So I think that's going to be a venue where that question actually gets addressed on what the mechanics are for access, what the federation, identity management, all those thorny issues that need to be sorted out. So as I said, I'll deflect that piece, but for sure that's on our radar. With respect to when is it going to be ready for the current community? For the Cosmos platform, again, Sandeep can jump in any time, but in fall of 2000, so when the Cosmos team submitted their proposal, they submitted a large number of sample representative experiments. Some of them were based on millimeter wave. The early ones are going to be done by the NYU and Columbia team, as well as they've solicited some lead users, extreme users, quote unquote, to actually provide feedback on what these systems are capable of doing. So questions like, CSI per antenna on millimeter wave systems. Okay, if you can't give us, what can you give us? Is it useful enough for us? So there are a series of workshops starting in fall 2018, which will sort of recruit users in each of the domains that Cosmos is building. So there is a millimeter wave component on the RF side. There's a fully optical, reconfigurable optical backbone overlay, which will basically address that community. There's a networking SDN edge cloud component. So these components will run multiple different workshops to gather user requirements input, as well as develop sample representative experiments that will be available to the broader community. In terms of the go-live date for the platforms, when it will be available, in terms of what the development roadmap or timeline has, that has it for late November 2019. So that's a year and 3 months, from now, is when it's open to everybody. Because it's effectively, if you think about it, it's not just, it's an infrastructure project. It's essentially a building a city-scale network. So we're sort of some of the issues that, Ted laid out at the end about right-of-ways, access to streetlight furnitures. We are going through all of that.
All right,
I mean, the team is too.
So yeah, I think I would like to make a few comments about that too.
Sure.
That, so we are getting, and I'm sure that this is, hello? Yeah. That this is a confusion. People are getting power. So this just one of the discussions. There are two different things going on. We don't want to make this a power session. They just started. I'm sure NYU and Rutgers and Columbia would be, doing their thing. That's going to be happening. But the test bed, a lot of people have this misconception. What is power doing, and what the community test beds that we were trying to get an input on, that the first bullet item that Manu had. So I want to just clarify a couple of things. Power, all of these power test beds are going to be more infrastructure, and all of them should be able to support millimeter wave experiments. Cosmos is one where that is one of the components of it specifically. The later ones may have bigger components on that. But what we are looking at, one of the things that in this panel discussion, and I want to just make some brief comments, is maybe towards the second half, we will discuss it more explicitly, is what is the need? So some people may be satisfied with, working with power platform, whatever they provide them. But there are other people, I would say my group at Wisconsin, we were building, and I have to be careful, we are building a test bed, and that's going to be, we have a different, less expensive way of doing beamforming. We're also trying to create an end-to-end solution where we built all the RF hardware ourselves, antennas. We have FPGAs too. We are developing the code. Berkeley is doing that with Hydra. And And so, some places are trying to get that end-to-end system, but different people have different expertise. There are other members of the community who are not here today who are taking 60 gigahertz thing, velocity or something, and they're more focused on network layer experiments and end-to-end. So the goal here is there an interest in the community to develop something in parallel to power, or almost independent of power in some ways, which will enable smaller scale experimentation within their institutions. So one of the ideas which Greg came up, so first thing would be, okay, who are the RF people who build antennas, who are interested in building antennas for the such test beds, or RF front end, for example? Who are the people who would be interested in ADCs, DACs, and looking at those boards and combining that with FPGA backends, because you'll need FPGAs for any kind of real-time implementation? And then who would be interested in developing the FPGA code so that you can even do or interface with an end-to-end networking interface? These are different expertise, but I know that in this community, all of those folks exist, expertise exists. And then, so first thing is identifying who wants to work on these modules, create community-wide specifications for, what are the needs that we need, modular, and what it can do, and then fill in some of the other expertise outside ones where, for example, these RF boards will be integrated, so, we have to outsource it to some companies. We don't have to work with big companies, and we are not, this is not a commercialization pathway, so we're not intruding on any big companies or anything. So is there an interest? Who are the players who would want to actually do the work? And then who are the researchers who would be interested in getting access to that platform? And at what cost, so that we have a complete idea of, okay, this is what we need, the community agrees to that, and these are the people who would build it, but at the end, once it's ready, perhaps there'll be 50 institutions who would be saying, oh yeah, we'd be interested in replicating that system at our institution. And so we need the community to kind of develop that roadmap if there is an interest, and we'll come back to that, and we'll send emails about that too, and then create a roadmap, plan, proposal, blueprint for what to be done, and then what resources are needed, and see and then, present it to us, and we'll see if we can make it happen. And now this will be complementary to power and any other platform it could be. I can see it being in Utah. I mean, it's a beautiful place for doing experiments. And New York City, absolutely. So it could be put in any and all power platforms. And yes, international collaboration, I think there are many, many multiple dimensions to it, and but I think I'm not fully prepared to answer that question right now. But it's, yeah.
Will NSF be paying for this?
For what? The second thing?
These infrastructures, no, for these experimental platforms.
The second part I'm talking about?
Expect the groups.
Yes. So what I'm saying is that right now, the CRI, MRIs, people can build components. So we can leverage those, or there could be new programs too. It's a question of, NSF wants to listen to the community. What are their needs? That's our power program came around, right? So what are the needs? If really there is a need, the community feels, and I've heard that, but are there people who are really interested in actually doing the work and working together to do it, then create a plan which is compelling, which you believe in, and then let us do the rest of the job. We will try our best. So anything is possible.